12th. Yep. You ready, Chris?
Yep.
Okay. Welcome, everyone, friends, families, partners, colleagues, to our 12th annual San Francisco Art Institute BA MA Thesis Symposium. I couldn't leave you with one more keynote, so here we go. So the programs started, we graduated our first MAs in the History and Theory of Contemporary Art and Exhibition Museum Studies and Urban Studies, which has transformed into Art, Place, and Public Studies in 2008. Our first MA MFA dual degree was in 2009, my first typo of the day. And then I just wanted to say just a couple words about the dual degree, because as many of you know, it's been kind of my project I have tremendous pride in. And it's not because I don't adore the MAs and the MFA standalone programs, but I just feel like the dual degree really expresses what we do best at the San Francisco Art Institute in its pairing of theoretical, historical scholarship and the work you do in the studios. Our first BA in History and Theory of Contemporary Art graduated in 2010. And at this point, believe it or not, we have 125 alums, including the 13 of you, all doing interesting things. Parents, families, they're all gainfully employed, so all is well. And they're all still making, writing, thinking exciting things. Okay, so for those of you who are here with us for the first time, but also for those of you who have been here, I just wanted to remind you about who built this program and who has sustained this program. So I wanted to begin with the two men who really conceived of, had extraordinary vision for our programs. And the first is Okwui and Wazar, one of the greatest curators ever, the most powerful intellect I've ever encountered. And you know, he passed away last spring. He's a great loss for the art world at large. But he was our Dean of Academic Affairs between 2005 and 2009. And you know, there's so much to tell you about Okwui, but I think the two key things are that it wasn't so long ago when we didn't think about contemporary art globally. And Okwui, as much as anyone, really shifted that way of thinking about contemporary art all over the world, not in New York or Berlin or San Francisco or maybe LA. And then in the title of our program, the name of our program is History and Theory of Contemporary Art. And it's a mouthful, but it was it was well thought through, because for Okwui, he thought a lot about the way we bring the history into the present and how contemporary art is completely entangled with many pasts and many localities. And actually that phrase, thinking the present historically, he actually used it on the phone when he interviewed me. So it's, you know, obviously it stayed with me. Along with Okwui, this man, Hanru, another extraordinary peripatetic curator who's, you know, I'm certain still hopping around the globe, maybe not at the moment, but Hanru was our first chair of exhibition and museum studies and the director of exhibition and public programs, and also a really sort of visionary thinker in terms of the curriculum. He really thought of exhibitions as laboratories for ideas, And again, it's reflected in our name, which is Museum and Exhibition Studies. It's not a curatorial program, although it certainly serves most of you well in that way, but it was designed as a scholarly program. Those two didn't do it alone. There's also Jeanine Jabilski, who was the first chair of History and Theory of Contemporary Art. After that, she was our Dean of Academic Affairs. She has been at SFAI since 2002. I'm just going to ignore the 7 years when she wandered off and left us to be provost at CalArts. She has been back to our great fortune the past couple of years. And to me, Jeanine has been the greatest mentor. And she's the one who actually saw something in me when she appointed me to direct the MA and dual degree programs that, at that point I did not see in myself. So I will always be grateful to her for that. And then, can you guess who this is? Here's a clue. It is indeed Robin Ballinger, who from the beginning has taught global perspectives in modernity. She was the first chair of urban studies. She's been in SFAI since 2002, and she's the punk. I mean, there's Robin. And then I wanted to mention especially these 4 teachers who've, over the past decade, have just always been there and have been the backbones of our programs. First is Betty Sue Hertz, who has over the years been incredibly generous with her resources. She was with us for almost 11 years. She left last year to become the director and chief curator at Columbia's Wallach Art Gallery, and we miss her. Then there's this one, Andrea Dooley. Andrea Dooley has been teaching the Research and Writing Colloquium again for many, many years. And I say up there that not only does she have a formidable mind, she also has an excellent sense of humor. She needs that sense of humor because this is what the cohort looks like when they enter Andrea's class. I'll come back to that metaphor, but the second of these 4 people is, of course, Dale Carrico, and he is listed here as the OGS. Yes, an old gangster, but also the old Good Shepherd, or the original Good Shepherd, because he taught the thesis seminar for many years, and we just thought you needed more of Dale's, encyclopedic brain. So we then asked him to teach the introductory critical theory. This picture, honestly, is the best picture I could find of Dale. So the fact that he's a self-proclaimed Luddite is evidenced here. And then this is the current Good Shepherd, Frank Kind but Firm Schmigel. And here you are. Now, yes, now I will drop the metaphor because there's absolutely nothing sheep-like about any of you. So here's the real Frank Schmigel, who's been, of course, the thesis seminar instructor, chair of museum and exhibition studies. He does have a day job, which is director of arts programming and partnerships at Fort Mason Center for Arts and Culture. And he has the patience of a saint. I just want to ask you all, any of you has a daily writing practice yet? And then we have Zaina. I guess the mantra at the grad at the grad building is "Go Ask Zaina," and that I've heard that a million times. I also wanted to mention Zaina forever has catered every event with Lamed, and I'm sure all of you have had Lamed at multiple functions, and I tease her about just being so sick of it, and I have to say today I wish we had those platters sitting out there for you after the symposium, but not today. And then we have Nikki Korth. This was Nikki yesterday because I kept changing little details about the program. So the program's up. I hope all of you know. Today I think they're going to put it up as a downloadable file with abstracts and shares. Then these two, Christopher Paddock, our AV wizard, who's usually up in the booth in the lecture hall. Christopher is the hardest working person that I've known at SFAI. Every single time I see Chris, he's in full run, because somebody needs him to fix something. So at least Chris gets to sit today, but no matter how busy he gets, he's got that smile. And then Katrataris, who just came to our rescue. Frank and I kind of pulling this together, helping us get things together over the past week or so. And it was Kat's birthday yesterday. So happy birthday, Kat. Okay, so now let me introduce our respondent. Also, just a backbone of our programs. And it really just means the world that she's here with us today. There is Nicole Archer. And just a bit about Nicole. She has a PhD in History of Consciousness from the History of Consciousness program at Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz. She did work with Donna Haraway, which I think about 5 of you quote Donna Haraway in your talk. So she got her MA in Cultural History at Goldsmiths. Her theoretical bent is critical and psychoanalytic theory, corporeal feminism, performance studies. She was at SFAI between 2013 and 2018, where she was assistant professor in the History and Theory of Contemporary Art, chair of History and Theory of Contemporary Art and Liberal Studies, and she did just, lots and lots and lots of other very cool stuff. Her emphasis is textile and garment histories. She's currently working on a manuscript titled A Looming Possibility Toward a Theory of the Textile. She's the all-time winner in the Best Heels collection. So, it's too bad we can't see them today, but Nicole should also know that the sort of any fashion sense at SFAI took a nosedive after she left. We barely try anymore. So, okay, and now Nicole is assistant professor of art and design at Montclair State University. She's working on a critical studies program. She's published in Women in Performance, Journal of Feminist Theory, Textile, the Journal of Cloth and Culture, Criticism, a quarterly journal for literature and the arts. Most recently, she contributed to the New Museum and MIT Press's recent installment of the critical anthology series, Art and Culture, Trapdoor, Transcultural Production and the Politics of Visibility, by Raina Gossett, Eric A. Stanley, also taught at SFAI for quite a time, and Johanna Burton. And in fact, Nicole's is one of the essays that Frank teaches in the thesis seminar as exemplary. fairly recently, she was resident scholar in the Department of Women's Studies, Beatrice Bain Research Center at UC Berkeley. Okay, and this weird thing happens right here. Let me come back to this. Anyway, Nicole, this is the one thing Nicole wanted me to mention, and I'm going to screw it up, but currently she is the editor-in-chief of Art Journal's Art Journal Open at the College Art Association, and so check it out. There's the link, but we can share it with you later. Okay. I don't know. Nicole. That's how happy I am to have her here. And ta-da! I mean, I know. I just probably made everybody even more nervous about this. Nicole's brilliance, but she's really not that scary. Okay, so here's the troupe for today. I actually asked everyone to send me photos of each other and hanging out and so on. This is the only one I got, but it does what I wanted to do. It gives you a sense of how how tight and loving and funny and that this cohort is. I mean, every cohort has a kind of spirit, and yours has been particularly lively and generous. And okay, I have an image or two for each presenter, and I just wanted everybody to have in their minds that these students are multiply talented. Many of them are dual degree students. So I wanted to show you a bit of their work, and there are certainly connections between their work and their writing. So kind of keep the images in your brain. So this is Whitney, who will be our first presenter, our Rocket Queen. This is T-Shell. I think so many feelings is a direct quotation. This is Sami's work. Sami is the shy radical, and it's true because they got us kicked off YouTube during the dress rehearsal. Here's a photo from Blanca, who is our poetic soul. This is the other image that Blanca sent, and I just want to add 2 words. Not yet. This is John, Firestarter Hartford. Another of John's images, just so you can see the patina and bloom and decay of John's work. This is not the image Sophia sent. It's an image that I really love, though, and I told Sophia, the first time I met her, that I thought that she thought with objects or thinks with objects in a really extraordinary way, and we've been trying to figure out what I meant by that for 3 years now. Okay, so this is Seraphina. Seraphina is our one BA in History and Theory of Art, Contemporary Art today. The BAs, and I think it's actually Nicole who started this, have long been referred to as the unicorns because they're quite rare beasts, maybe 1 or 2 each year. But here we have Seraphina, unicorn with a banjo. Then Henry's up. Henry is our man of mystery, and that's such a terrifying photograph, but he's not terrifying at all, and you'll see why I chose it when he gives his talk. This is Merve. Merve is our Fulbright scholar. I remember the day I interviewed Merve like it's yesterday. Actually, many of you, I remember your interviews like they were yesterday. Merve's got family and friends watching in Turkey. Blanca in Spain, Young in China. So we've got a pretty amazing audience today. This is the image that Young sent, and it's I haven't quite figured it out yet. I think it's the condition of the thesis writing experience, but it's kind of Magrittean, Steinbergian. And then Giuliana, aka G-Funk, will bring us to a conclusion, and Giuliana, definitely worth the wait. So I wanted to just kind of end my little part of this with these words by T.S. Eliot. This day is always very bittersweet for me, this year more so. And I came across this and just felt like it was perfect. So for last year's words belong to last year's language, and next year's words await another voice. And to make an end is to make a beginning. Today, this is me. Okay, so just to let you know the shape of the day, we'll begin in a moment with our first session and our first speaker, Whitney Humphreys. That session will go from 10:30 to 12:30 with 4 presenters, followed by a Q&A with Nicole. Then we'll take a lunch break from 12:30 to 1 p.m. We felt like, we're not all wandering off to lunch. In fact, I'm sitting in my kitchen, so I can walk 2 feet. So it's a fairly short lunch break. That will be followed by session 2 from 1 to 3. Again, 4 presenters, followed by Q&A with Nicole. Then we'll take a break, followed by our third session from 3:30 to 5:30. And then, again, 3 presenters, followed by a Q&A, then a few closing remarks and toasts. And I will be back sort of at the shift over points. So I'm going to unshare my screen so that Whitney can set up, and I will introduce the first session, the presenters in the first session. Oh, I also just wanted to mention that we've left some time within this structure for any kind of snafus that, any technological snafus. So it is a pretty generous timing. So we may take a little less time, but just be cognizant if you want people to be here specifically for your talk, to let them know, about when you'll be speaking. Okay. All right. Whitney, just give me 1 second. Okay, so this is our first session. We'll begin with Whitney Humphreys, who is receiving her dual degree in History and Theory of Contemporary Art and Studio Art. Her thesis is titled Gendered Machines, and I had the luck of being her committee chair. The readers were Dale Carrico and Frank Schmigel. Our second speaker will be T. Shell. T's getting their dual degree in History and Theory of Contemporary Art and Studio Art. Their thesis is titled Fragile Contains Feelings, Public Intimacies, the Stressed Body in Contemporary Performance Art. Their committee is made up of Dale Carrico, Laura Richard, and Frank Schmigel. Third speaking will be Sami Cutrona. They're receiving their MA in the History and Theory of Contemporary Art, but I have to say they've become a pretty extraordinary artist in their time here. Thesis is titled Queering Representation, Abstraction, and Autonomy. Their committee is Jordan Resnick, Andrea Dooley, and Frank Schmigel. And the fourth speaker of the first panel is Blanca Bercial, who's getting her MA in History and Theory of Contemporary Art. It's titled Listening to the Infamous, an Artistic Sensibility to Listen to the Liminal Crossings of Sound in San Francisco. Blanca's committee consists of Cristobal Martinez as chair, Guillermo Galindo, and Frank Schmigel as readers. And again, that will be followed by a Q&A with Nicole, and I will reappear at the end of that and send everyone off to lunch. So again, thank you so much for being here.
Hello. All right, let me share my screen. Okay. All right. Hi, my name is Whitney Humphreys. Claire already said that a lot. Thank you so much for the intro. I'm excited to kick off the symposium by presenting my thesis. As she said, it's called Gendered Machines. This work represents the culmination of not only the last 3 years of practicing and studying arts and academics. I believe that any work that is important to us is built from the experiences and knowledge we've gained all our lives and will only continue to develop in our lifetime pursuit of making and learning. Before I begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the many people who've contributed enormously to this achievement. Nothing I'm about to present would have been possible without the consistent guidance and encouragement from my thesis committee, led by Claire Daigle, enriched by Dale Carrico, and fortified by Frank Schmigel. Thank you all for believing that this work was worth doing and for providing me with both the tightrope and the safety net I needed to make this journey. I would also like to thank my parents, my peers, my partner, and my every advocate for your unwavering support and compassion in this pursuit. We never achieve anything alone or without love. A gendered machine is any non-human mechanical object that is associated with, signifies, or explicitly assigned a gender. My project is concerned with understanding how these phenomena manifest in both lived and fictional realities. Here, a typical polarization is revealed in our relationships to machines. Forms of labeling that reflect limited understandings of gender identity are imposed onto the objects that people create, use, and identify with, where things are generally understood to be either objects of service or of domination. This is the patriarchal oversimplification that my work seeks to complicate. The descriptor gendered machines also reflects the culturally constructed mechanisms by which categorization is imposed onto the ways we choose or are allowed to identify. The criteria for correctness, which dictate the imagery and objects that culturally define us, are nearly always generated out of patriarchal projections. Just as an ideal femininity is socially invented to serve male desires, technological artifacts, tools, and media are built to fulfill the needs of the historically male-controlled landscape of invention. A century of cinema has both traditionally objectified feminine bodies and has depicted technology through a similarly gendered lens, contributing enormously to the shared cultural assumptions that continue into the development and delivery of technological products. Because popular films have long taught us that women are objects of use and desire, and advertisement has marked machine appliances with the same rhetorical code, It should come as no surprise that so many fictional and real robots are gendered feminine. Guiding this project is an intent to understand the effects that tropes within pop culture representations actively have on our shifting relationship to mechanical objects, from common utilitarian tools to instruments of monumental power. I focus this work within 3 scopes: body, voice, and spirit, each acting as a nexus where patterns of signification are explored across works within a century of robot films. Through these lenses, I address how common socio-spiritual relationships converge within figurations of the mechanical, both worshipped and feared for the power that they hold. The imagined ideal of progress, featured throughout the science fiction genre, is both a figurative and very real expression of patriarchal dominance over the world, through a mastery and wielding of science. When fantastical figurations of the future sync the creation of a humanoid technology with traditions of powerful feminized tropes, audiences are left to wrestle with her simultaneous signification as both an idol and a demon. This project's origins are located in a commonly asked question with a multitude of proposed justifications. Why does my iPhone's voice sound feminine? Professor of computer science, Melanie Mitchell, has said, people worry that computers will get too smart and take over the world, but the real problem is that they're too stupid and they've already taken over the world. Typical science fiction figurations of mainly masculine performing robotic units have inspired a fear that machines' potential for superintelligence. But for me, it's clear that the danger of real artificially intelligent figures lies in their fundamental lack of complexity and in the power that they are already granted. If directly asked, each of the most popular AI voice assistants claims in their own programmed words to be genderless. However, they do not deny that the way they talk, their voice, the entire expression of their being evokes femaleness by default. Because Siri, Cortana, and Alexa are made to reinforce gendered expectations of subservience and complacency, they are produced through patterns of fictional representation. They are encoded figuratively as trustworthy and non-threatening. The continued oversimplification of identity as it relates to AI to traditional binary gender roles is especially confounding when acknowledging that any machine attributed with a familiar feminized humanhood is effectively performing gender. In this way, these robots happen to paradoxically participate in contemporary feminist discourse on gender as a form of performativity, and thus possess the fundamental capacity for a spectral range of possibility. By creating artificial representations of humanness, requiring an application of gender identity in order to render them widely perceivable as such, AI companies possess an opportunity to disrupt the systematic ways that personhood is understood. However, by aligning these built identities with existing and often damaging representations of femininity, the industry only ever reinscribes the binary gender structure. Many objects that are today ubiquitous draw direct influence from imaginary visions of a brighter future. However, by constructing objects for the imagined future that only extend attitudes of the past, both the products we use and the stories they are influenced by contain the potential for disruption, yet routinely replicate the way gender is structured within each other's contexts. In each chapter of this project, pairs of films are aligned based on their linked characterizations of robotic figures. Patterns or contrasts between them reflect the gendered power dynamics that drive their narratives. Each film illustrates a conflation of fantasies and fears that are embedded deeply in the canon of Western storytelling, garnering new relevance in the lived experiences that reflect their influence today. Allegorically expressed in any attempt to artificially construct a life form, the unending techno-extension of the self is revealed as acutely gendered, manifesting as an endeavor to procreate without mother, or in the long fantasized masculinist dream to construct the perfect woman, obedient, nurturing, and built to an imagined perfection. The first of 3 chapters, Body, addresses ways that gendered relationships to machines are often reflected in filmic treatment of a feminine robot. Here, Fritz Lang's Metropolis is marked as an origin point for films that depict a mad scientist constructing a feminized figure. Bookended by the 2015 film Ex Machina, this shared narrative is analyzed for the ways its cultural significance has shifted across decades of film and technological advancement. In either scenario, the agency granted to a robotic woman incites chaos to establish systems of patriarchal order. However, the source of villainy within both films remains ambiguous. Chapter 2 is titled Voice and brings focus to disparate characterizations of supposedly disembodied robotic figures, represented mainly by the voice emission. Extending the comparison frequently cited in analyses of series gender identity, this chapter marks the AI voice assistant Samantha of Spike Jonze's 2013 film Her as the latest incarnation of a superintelligent computerized assistant that Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke imagined in 2001: A Space Odyssey. The robotic units in these two films are addressed for the ways that complex gendered power dynamics are reflected in their representations of villainy or heroism. In either, an immaterialist denial of the body results in cognitive distortion. The final chapter, Spirit, highlights the many ways that expressions of scientific mastery mirror figurations of mechanical or magical or religious ideologies. Employing an ecofeminist lens, I begin to unpack the ways these play out institutionally, dependent always on an exploitation of environments manipulated to facilitate unlimited extension of the self. Here I analyze the ways this is illustrated by differing representations of prosthetic bodily enhancement within the Star Wars and Mad Max films. This comparison reveals modes that cyborg representation can open possibilities through figurations of gender and machine that are liberatory and do not rely on established structures of power and agency to function. It can feel as though paradoxes lie in the Western cultural legacy of humanoid machines, where the significance of representations of soulless, lifeless service beings and subsequent real-world reflections of them are muddled with fantasies of birth, desire, and transcendence. If a robot is a slave being, for instance, its relationship to either parental or erotic fantasies of dominance is both clear and complex. The link between beings constructed for subordination and visions of superhuman advancement attained through a fusion with such beings, though, generates dissonant reactions to the layers of signification made by a robotic figure. A road to some clarity can be found through the notion that these seemingly contradictory associations ultimately develop out of an expression of the same historical compulsion to maintain control over nature obtained through a mastery of scientific capabilities to become more powerful than God. This is the same central claim often made within discourses that address Mary Shelley's Gothic classic through feminist frameworks. A Frankenstein story in one form or another is at the heart of any attempt to construct a life form, either within fiction or in the fields of scientific practice that are influenced by them. Likewise, in both fictional extensions of the Frankenstein myth and in the project to extend the self via technology, a troubling threat remains when granting agency to a manufactured being. In order to compensate for the fear generated by the possibility of the creation overpowering the creator, dissonant measures are often made, whether through a troubling resolution to a story arc or in attempts to develop a transcendent union with artificially intelligent software. Examples of this form of compensation can be located within the films under analysis in this project. The Metropolis narrative, for one, can easily be called a futurological incarnation of a Frankenstein scenario, while also concluding with ambiguous messages about the consequences of liberation. The stories contain critiques of gendered power dynamics that are in many ways aligned. Thea von Harbo's novel, on which Lang's interpretation is based, is a woman's reaction to the rapidly shifting world towards globalized industrialization figured within characterizations of the mad scientist and his construction, just as Shelley's is. Like Mary Shelley's critique of male fantasies of reproduction, representing man's need to impose control over the world, usurping God and womanhood by at last claiming power to create life, Metropolis invites the audience to question who the monster is. Extending significant treatments of Dr. Frankenstein as the quintessential mad scientist, Metropolis's Rotwang emerges in an additional complication to the gender dynamics of regeneration in his creation of the Maria robot. The crazed inventor confounds generation as Dr. Frankenstein does by becoming a combined parental unit in his seizure of women's ability to give birth. Rotwang enacts a fantasy of constructing a robot bride, a desire to create the other, thus depriving it of its otherness, by producing a conjoined perfect lover and/as an extension of his procreative self. In doing so, this gesture is imagined to render him godlike in his mastery of life, women, and machine. The troubled genius and fictional tech giant Nathan, as the 21st century incarnation of the mad scientist in Ex Machina, is both participating in and again further complicating the wife bot trope in Maria's tradition. Though it's revealed that his masterpiece, Ava, was constructed to both represent his own scientific prowess and to serve his own needs as a sex bot. Because of the intelligence she has been imbued with, the narrative is centered on her escape. Throughout the film, the creation of a feminized robot is employed as a way to explicitly address the reality that identity is always something constructed and performed. Here, gendering a machine is understood as an expression of control through categorization in order to limit possibilities and to avoid unpredictability, loss of established power, or the threat of chaos. An artificially intelligent figure itself can in these ways function as a means for disrupting such frameworks, and thus possesses the fundamental capacity for a range of possibility. However, by retaining traditionally gendered power dynamic between creator and created, the fantasy to build a wife bot effectively fails to open up some of the possibilities that futuristic visions supposedly promise. But because Ex Machina's Ava and the Maria robot, as incarnations of the Frankenstein monster, ultimately free themselves from the master's control, an object with its own agency paradoxically represents an inversion of power. By animating the inanimate, the inventor attempting to impose order inadvertently invites disorder. Extending these interpretations, the AI computer scientist, both inspired and represented by such narratives, can be critiqued as engaging in a pursuit to birth a manufactured consciousness existing beyond bioorganic means of production. However, if more measures are not actively taken to employ robotic design as a way to construct identities that do not conform to normative limitations, we should be fearful of their continued ubiquity, not because they would disrupt ordered systems of control, but because they would not. With each of the figures analyzed in these chapters, this project is concerned with identifying significant moments in the history of robotic imagery that have contributed to constructing expectations for the ways that humans relate to each other and our built environment. In preparing this research, I sought insight into the spiral of back and forth influence generated between science fiction and our scientific reality. Probing narratives that have come to bridge the ambiguous line between truth and fiction, narratives that both the genre and the contemporary computer science industry are in many ways rooted in. This project is a deconstruction of such figurative structures, with an intention to recognize modes for their disruption, as well as opportunities to build futures with equity and responsibility from their parts. I conclude my analysis with the figure Imperator Furiosa, the androgynous amputee lead of Mad Max Fury Road, a 2016 re-envisioning of the original masculinist vigilante series into an imagined future that normalizes differently abled bodies. Refreshing this series, director George Miller has not only imbued it with continued significance as a cautionary depiction of impending ecological disaster, he has also refocused his representations of the future onto a project of justice conveyed through characters like Furiosa, who carry the story with strength in the form of feminine empowerment through community support, rather than individualistic macho aggression that drove the original franchise. In this way, the film reflects key concepts within discourses of disability justice, concerned with developing imagined futures that reject the Western cultural myth of independence, a fantasy of control which imagines technological extension of the self as a pathway towards ultimate power, dependent always on exploitation of natural resources and an erasure of other bodies. Though scholars have argued whether depictions of a cyborg body are able to either empower differently abled audiences through representation or are ultimately harmful by suggesting that prosthetic and technological intervention are necessary for disabled bodies to appear whole, through my analysis, Furiosa specifically, as an atypical expression of both femininity and a robotically supported body, offers us a way out of instrumentalizing representations of the feminized robotic figure, traditionally coded as a tool or prize in service of expansionist agendas. Instead, we are able to view the embodied experience of disability as presenting alternative ways of understanding ourselves in relation to our environment, each other, and our constructions. I'd like to end with a quote from influential feminist scholar Donna Haraway's 1988 essay, Situated Knowledges. This piece calls for a reimagined process of learning that's based on conversational interaction with each other, our world, and our tools, as well as an acknowledgement of one's own limitations, rather than traditional structures of producing knowledge by using instruments of control to look, analyze, and speak from positions of untouchable power. Here she states, there is no unmediated photograph or passive camera obscura of scientific accounts of bodies and machines. There are only highly specific visual possibilities, each with a wonderfully detailed, active, partial way of organizing worlds. All these pictures of the world should not be allegories of infinite mobility and interchangeability, but of elaborate specificity and difference and the loving care that one might take to learn how to see faithfully from another's point of view, even when the other is our own machine. Thank you. I'm going to pass myself over.
Let me just take a couple seconds to get ready. Sorry. Hi, hello. My name is T-Shell. As Claire stated, my project entitled Fragile Contains Feelings, Public Intimacies, the Stressed Body in Contemporary Performance Art, embodies the voice of an artist scholar. This means that what you are about to hear and see are an accumulation of ideas and concepts I am constantly considering from both a writer and artist perspective. I would like to thank my chair, Dale Carrico, for his unwavering support through my entire career here at SFAI. To Laura Richards and Claire Daigle for giving me the artistic language to speak, and to Frank Schmingel and Andrea Dooley for pushing me through this incredibly emotionally and physically exhaustive process. before I get too far into this presentation, I want to express that the following will discuss traumas as they pertain to a multitude of identities. Though I don't go too much into depth, there will be a couple of semi-graphic images that could be triggering. This is an unprecedented time, excuse me. So please take any necessary precautions to take care of yourself and your well-being. Holding space has been taken up by psychologists and therapeutic Instagram posts or hashtags. But in this project, I mean to deploy the concept of holding space in a theoretical context. As humans, we all have the need to be seen and to be heard. And yet as Americans, we continue to submit uncritically to traditional and perpetuated systems and depictions of being. Through this conditioning, we have been culturally encouraged to be unsympathetic towards others or see another person's uncomfortable emotions as a problem that needs to be solved. In popular jargon, holding space centers around maintaining the ability to listen fully to another person without judgment. Part of holding space is allowing people to come to their own answers on their own terms, even if this process can seem difficult. It is a way of trusting the strength of a person under duress, offering them support as and when and how they need it, but in a way that resists becoming self-dignifying or controlling. This feels like the most relevant thread through when looking at the concepts, through when looking at the ways in which people occupy space interpersonally. And so I will enact this concept as a framework in ways many marginalized community groups already have, as a means of reinforcing that specific community's efforts of holding space. Taking up this mantle is an effort of solidarity and support to provide even more space to other bodies who are still not being met in their lives. When it comes to holding space, nothing is demanded of the person needing the support. Rather, the support is just given when asked. There is also an overarching trust between the person offering the support and the person receiving it. This trust is maintained and built through the process itself as well, a kind of internal world building. It should go without saying, in this kind of context, that if the person receiving needs something more or different than what they initially received as support, that they will ask for it. Doing so never cause a person to feel judgment or as if they owe anything in return for being given that support. Through therapy and concepts of holding space, what holding space could look like have not been only frameworks for many marginalized communities, such as but not limited to the Black feminist group, the Combahee River Collective, and Black Lives Matter, or LGBTQAI spaces and communities such as BDSM. They also remain concepts that can be interpreted in many scholarly books related to traumas. In The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, he writes, as a witness to real life experiences of traumas and their aftermath. In the book, Kolk goes through systems to adapt with traumatic situations, suggesting efforts like therapy, which provide physical and mental space for a person's own voice and experience. While embracing the generational and historical traumas and treatment within America, Kolk's self-help book serves as a good alternative resource for many people who seek agency and solidarity without feeling like they are being spoken down to. In Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, she describes similar concepts of holding space, but takes it to a more philosophical level. She suggests that what is important within this current socio-political climate is learning to stay with the trouble of living and dying together on a damaged earth, and how doing so will prove more conducive to the kind of thinking that would provide the means to build more livable futures. These concepts are defined even further in Haraway's 2017 lecture at San Francisco Art Institute. She defines our communities as kinships. To me, this suggests that we are in conscious existence together, with no being of greater importance than another. Haraway names this shared state as the multi-species responsibility that we have towards one another. For Haraway, the things that have gotten in humans' way, like a roadblock on the highway, is our own toxic relationship to domestication and capital. I believe that both Kolk and Haraway's understanding of what relationships between humans should and could be reflects the frameworks of holding space. Further, their naming of our own current socio-political structures as the failures of our own inability to engage in those kinds of understood relationships is affirming for me as someone who is constantly unsettled by person-to-person engagement. As an artist scholar, making and thinking about the possibilities of holding space, I have immersed myself in the practice, discourse, and histories of performance as a mode for accessing this concept. The medium of performance has allowed me to find a way to fully express myself and my vision, and to communicate to people what I feel and have to say in a way that I have not been able to do before. Something both compelling and fundamental to performance, as related to theater, is that it demands an audience. The things that I want to say are being heard in this way. The invisible pains are rendered visible by embodying the pain live. The ability to enact manifestations of psychological pain by causing myself physical distress allows me to cathartically process traumatic events of my life. In short, I use art therapeutically. In my performances, I enact the aesthetic of objection. For me, the abject functions the same way the performance medium does. Similar to goth identity, abjectness allows darkness to be the way that to be seen outwardly, even though it is a manifestation of often internalized uncomfortable feelings. The way that abjection generally functions is by being inherently intriguing and repulsive. Even the most potentially passive viewer, who may otherwise not be interested in taking the time to understand performance, has an inroad to my work. This abjection only amplifies the function of performance to draw an audience, for better or for worse. Another way that the abject functions is by being extremely visceral, in the way that someone experiences something in this aesthetic is often internalized and unanticipated. One places themselves in the position of the person experiencing the action, making it difficult to process or name the effect. The viewer has no choice but to hold the space for the performance because of hold the space something we have currently learned to dismiss for institutionally marginalized individuals. To try and understand these relationships further, I benchmark this association of personal experiences and historically othered individuals against 3 contemporary artists living within these identities. Doreen Gardner. Gardner brings historical traumas from cross-sections of racism and sexism to the contemporary medium of performance. She does so to highlight agency within narratives of and for Black women generationally. Castles. Castles, whose work centers around transgender and non-binary bodies, whose experiences become invisible to the majority. Further reflected is a call to action towards the nation's lack of a stance on the violence and murders of the LGBTQAI+ community throughout history. And Jennifer Locke. Locke's work as a whole questions gender roles and relationships between the body and structures of power. She uses her own experience within communities not widely promoted for her gender, such as wrestling and BDSM, as modes to elevate her and foster relationships she aims to challenge. For the sake of time, I am going to delve into one artist a bit, and that will be Castles and their piece Becoming an Image. Originally inspired and commissioned by the One Archives of Los Angeles in 2012, the artist utilized the blacked out bare bones of a gutted archival room as the site for their fight in total darkness. Only caught by the flash of a camera being used to document the event, the performance addresses various issues of accountability, the role of artist and photographer, and the roles of the witness, the aggressor, and the documenter. What is interesting about this work in particular is that the performances live on in numerous iterations within their artistic practice. The live performance itself is still revisited and performed today at a variety of locations around the world. The conscious choice by the artist to go back to the same action in the same performance time and time again is important. To me, a performer myself, repetition of a performance is figuratively a visualization of healthier modes for healing and holding space. In an interview, Castles acknowledges this. I think that after this administration change, I wanted to make work about our community, about providing rituals for restoration, for healing, for witnessing our own traumas that exist amongst the incredibly varied striations of class and race which exist within the LGBTQ community. Repetition in this performance becomes the origin for sculptural, sound, and photographic iterations that are left behind. Though these new pieces assume different titles, each provides a new entry to experience the live performance aspect. In this way, the piece becomes relics of physical memorials or traumas as it affects the trans body and inadvertently the queer community. Another reason why I've chosen the word relics is because it is evidentiary, but also the artists themselves is interested in, again, providing rituals for restoration. And so relics feels like a good middle ground of naming these objects that engage with a ritual process. Throughout this section, I use common symbols such as ghosts and grave markers to try and pinpoint this ephemeral yet existentially exhaustive piece of work. Today, I will touch on one of these, which I haven't yet named, darkness. Darkness is a key factor in Castle's ability to get viewers to let down their passive walls or guards. Darkness is an element that plays out in becoming an image, and yet is something we fear. And yet to close our eyes to that fear would put us at the mercy of another darkness, obliviousness. It is those outside of ourselves and commonly in positions of power's perspectives of darkness that makes darkness the fear we publicly understand it to be today. In The Mother of All Questions, Rebecca Solnit explores darkness as embraced by Virginia Woolf. Solnit suggests that for Woolf, the evening lends itself to a society of strangers that doesn't enforce identity but liberates it. Not only is this idea of dark true for Woolf, but it remains true within queerness. Darkness, in this example, the evening, is used as a place of refuge by the community, the largest example of that being Central Park, a popular place for meeting, cruising, and marches for the LGBTQ+ community. To this point, castles could be understood as literally creating a darkened space for acceptance. Performing in total darkness and a gutted out space physically creates a void for the artist's actions and emotions to fill. The viewers watching are therefore, in the case of darkness, unable to traditionally and institutionally treat or label the actions being performed or the body performing them. This stripped down nature of darkness lends itself to defamiliarization, with no objects or visuals to latch onto as the experience is happening, leaving the viewers with nothing to ground themselves, figuratively, represents a time or place where a person impacted by traumas can release through performative action. In the darkness, figurative traumas of trans bodies are depicted as timeless and placeless, happening anywhere, at any time, to any body. The figurative traumas and its spanning through time can also literally represent the multi-valency and danger darkness can have in terms of representation, visibility, and believability of the transgender identity. In Becoming an Image is in that sense a history that is non-chronological. It is impossible to pin down the reality these lives face, and that is what gets left behind in the impressions of raw clay, the bronze casts, the sound that envelops the viewer's body, and the images that demand something of you. Regardless of the names or the forms it has and it continues to take, which in itself is a metaphor for the transgender and non-binary experience. Becoming an Image demands your immediate attention to the transgender narrative being created. We, a word here meaning me, and the LGBTQAI+ community, and the relics of becoming an image. Like every person on this earth, just want to be seen, regardless of how many lights are on in the room. When it comes to castles, Doreen Garner and Jennifer Locke, these three contemporary artists engage their viewers and ultimately the public majority by choosing to physically manifest a depiction of personal identity and experience. As Donna Haraway reminds us in Staying with the Trouble, mixed up times are overflowing with both pain and joy, with vastly unjust patterns of pain and joy, with unnecessary killing of ongoingness, but also with necessary resurgence. The task is to make kin and lines of invertive connection as a practice of learning to live and die well with each other in a thick present. None of these actions would be possible if it weren't for these artists' tenacious spontaneity to go against our mainstream depictions of their identities, communities, and spaces. In choosing the action of performance, they are each claiming their agency. Jennifer, Garner, Castles, and Locke come from their own kinds of kinship, long histories of identity, which have been archived and categorized by institutions for better or for worse. By performing live, they bring these identities and the issues related to them out of the secret archives, hidden attic boxes, quiet whispers, thus exposing it while adding to its history in the process. Though vulnerably putting one's body out there publicly could lend itself to objectifications and misrepresentations, I believe the same could be true for when one opens their mouth to speak. Each artist's effort to amplify their control of elements such as the camera, projection, physical space, sound, and lighting. They create an experience that is foreign for the viewers. I believe this ultimately strips the audience of their learned inability to offer empathy, if only for even a moment. In short, performance offers an opportunity for fostering kinship as an environment where holding space can be possible. Thank you.
Hello, let me just get set up here. Hi, I'm Sami Cutrona. I first kind of want to start off with thanking my thesis committee, Jordan Resnick, Andrea Dooley, and Frank Schmigel for their time and energy in helping me complete this. My thesis is titled Queering Representation, Abstraction, and Autonomy. I first want to acknowledge that my presentation will contain some images of nudity, but like Claire alluded to in the beginning during our dress rehearsal, we got flagged because of YouTube's community standards, so I've had to navigate some censorship. One of the main images that I'm going to be analyzing, Robert Mapplethorpe's man in a polyester suit. I've had to edit a bit, but if you're so inclined to see the image in the full, there is a link to the image in the description, and it will also be included in the chat. But now I can get into my thesis, which centers around the work of Paul Mpagi Sepoya. He's a Black queer artist and photographer. He deals largely with the relationships between the camera, artist, and subject. Working in the vein of studio portraiture, Sepoya collaborates with his subjects to deconstruct and challenge the history of studio portraiture and the archetypes associated with the gay male nude. Through his use of mirrors, collage, and staging, Sepoya complicates the image plane and the subjective relationships within the image. His studio becomes a space for commentary on studio portraiture, the artist process, and queer identities. How are contemporary queer photographers considering their history of representation in visual culture? I compare and contrast the methodologies of Sepoya and his predecessor, Robert Mapplethorpe. I examine Mapplethorpe's representation of the Black male body and how this legacy has informed Black representation in contemporary photography. I examine the two artists' stark approaches to working in the studio space, their gaze, and their methodological approaches to abstracting the body. In this presentation, I'll be focusing on the two artists' varying approaches that are revealed in their studio spaces. The artist's studio has grown to be a point of fascination, a private space of contemplation and creation that requires an invitation extended by the artist to enter. Once inside, the studio can be a site of encounter, a place for working, creating, teaching, and entertaining. Robert Mapplethorpe worked in studio portraiture, and his studio became a space for gay male desire, control, and power dynamics to be illustrated in his portraiture. Paul Sepoya is challenging the practices of his predecessors and focusing on collaboration and reciprocity within the studio space. The traditional model followed by Sepoya's predecessors permeated complicated power dynamics that informed the culture of the studio. The culture of the studio is shaped by who is allowed access to the typically private space, the social dynamics within the space, and how power dynamics are navigated. How do Sepoya and Mapplethorpe's distinct studio cultures impact the visible and invisible power dynamics, representations of queer desire, and the artistic process? I argue that Sepoya is challenging the traditional use of the artist's studio by making the artist's private space visible, creating a queer social space, and making visible the power dynamics between artist and subject. The representation of the studio space has been a theme amongst artists beginning in the Renaissance. Rembrandt's Artist in His Studio is a painting that depicts a painter in process. With his tools in hand, he appears daunted by the large canvas in front of him. This painting serves as an example of what artists deem worthy of being represented when they pull back the curtain to reveal their working space. This painting is an early example of an artist revealing their private working space. In this work, the artist is present. This is signified by the painting tools made visible in the work, representing the creative process, the act of creating, contemplating, and visually representing the artistic process. The representation of the artist and process fulfills the viewer's desire to view the production, convention, and transformation of the artist as art and vice versa. This painting of an artist in his studio suggests the ability and desire for both artists and viewers to view the studio as a stage. The tradition of presenting the studio space extends into contemporary practices. Working against tradition, Sophia pulls back the curtain of control and concealing that is common in the convention of staging and studio portraiture. He mobilizes his vulnerability in the way he reveals the inner workings of the studio space to the viewer. He effectively invites the viewer to enter, making this private space public. His intentional staging makes visible to the viewer his tools in studio space, an open invitation to see the artist in process. Study Reflecting Duro is a self-portrait of Sophia photographed in his studio. In this work, one can see the camera, tripod, and various other tools that are used to create the image. He is shirtless, seated on a plywood bench, with his head lowered and back to the viewer, his pants lowered to expose his natal cleft. Sophia has positioned in his right arm a camera, aimed at his studio mirror. He's making explicit his vulnerability in the way that he and his tools are revealed in the image. This vulnerability is in stark contrast with the methods of control typically utilized in traditional studio portraiture, where the tools are not typically included in the image making. He subverts the voyeurism that is often perpetuated in studio portraiture by revealing and inviting in. He shifts the viewer from engaging with something private to being a welcome guest. Mapplethorpe's studio, following photographic tradition, was more often than not a place void of context, a sterile environment for staging portraits. His artistic practice remained behind the scenes. His tools, studio space, and all aspects of image making are not made visible in his images. His photograph, Man in a Polyester Suit, exemplifies his control and precision in image making. Common in studio photography, the subject is in front of the camera's lens, with the photographer behind the camera controlling its mechanisms. Mapplethorpe sought to control every variable: the light, form, composition, and ultimately the way in which his model would be viewed and received. He used these fundamentals of photography to control the depiction of his subjects and to thrust himself, and with that, his privilege and power, upon his subjects. Control is exemplified in this image, as his process and tools remain illegible to the viewer. Sophia's work simultaneously challenges photographic history and tradition, empowering him to create his own context within his space. In Study Reflecting Duro, we are invited to see a section of his studio, made recognizable by the cement floor and white walls, common in many artists' studios. While revealing his own studio, he references the art historical representation of artist studios. The orange peel laid on top of a white fabric in the bottom right-hand corner references the history of artists working within their studios, specifically Dutch artists working in the Golden Age. An invitation from the artist is required to enter. Sophia, in turn, reveals his site of creation and process, simultaneously making his space, to an extent, accessible to all. The studio space of both Sophia and Mapplethorpe acts as a stage, a place to build context for themselves and others within their photographic works. Sophia challenges the history of studio portraiture by layering vulnerability through his use of simultaneously making his tools, studio space, and process visible to the viewer. He is vulnerable with his subjects in that they together explore a dynamic of seeing and being seen by each other. Sophia's methodologies differ from that of his artistic predecessor, Mapplethorpe, whose studio space acts as a container. His tools, studio space, and in turn, his process are not made visible. He relies on others' vulnerability and implements layers of control and voyeurism in his space and process. Sophia's focus on collaboration creates a queer social culture within his studio space. His photographic practice consists of portraits taken of himself, friends, and lovers within his studio. At the heart of his practice seems to be a desire to find and convey communion between him and his subjects. Sequoia is examining pre-existing relationships and community building through his practice. Sequoia's methodology of collaborating and queer sociality creates a studio culture centered on a safe space for free expression. Rather than simply photographing his subjects, he collaborates with them in the image making, a queering of photographic tradition. Both he and his collaborators become the subjects in different ways. In Paul Sequoia and A.L. Steiner's darkroom mirror portrait, he invites fellow maker and friend Steiner into a studio to collaborate on a portrait. This portrait rejects the photographic tradition of hierarchy between artist and subject through collaboration. Steiner directed the image they have co-authored together. Sequoia has his collaborators make the exposures, decide which image is to be shown, and they ultimately determine how it will be exhibited. Sequoia is engaged mutually with his subjects, an equaling of power that does not exist in the traditional hierarchy of artist and subject. In the image, Sequoia can only be made identifiable by his arm emerging from the left, his hand placed on the camera and presumably pressing the shutter. Lying below the camera on a bench is Steiner, shirtless, smiling, gazing at herself in Sequoia's studio mirror with her hand around the camera's lens. Sequoia has put herself in a vulnerable, or Steiner rather, has put herself in a vulnerable position. She is semi-nude and laying on a bench while Sequoia stands above. We see his challenging of power dynamics in action with Steiner. Sequoia is reciprocating Steiner's vulnerability in the portrait and presumably their friendship. To create space for and capture vulnerability in an image requires a foundation of trust and safety. Steiner appears to have control of the focus of the lens while Sequoia controls the shutter. Two acts equal in necessity to create an image. Her agency in her engagement challenges histories of female representation in art traditions and simultaneously challenges ingrained power dynamics of artist and subject. Sequoia and Steiner's simultaneous engagement with the camera signifies a mutual and collaborative making of this image. Power dynamics between the camera and subject are revealed in this image as one that can determine that Sequoia is in control of the shutter, yet Steiner remains engaged and actively participates in these ambiguous power dynamics. The ambiguity being made apparent to the viewer as both subjects are engaging with the camera. Sequoia's predecessor, Mapplethorpe's studio culture, acts as an example of a traditional studio methodology that consists of directing the model and his specific studio culture informed by fleeting exchanges with men cruised by Mapplethorpe. Throughout his career, Mapplethorpe oscillated between photographing friends, lovers, and total strangers. During the 1980s, at the height of Mapplethorpe's self-proclaimed Black fever, he frequented Black social gathering spaces to scout for sex in his ideal Black male body for modeling. His method of seduction was to offer cocaine as a potential trade for sex. This method is grounded in a power dynamic that exists between his differing race and class of his Black models. He found models that needed something from him. They needed drugs, while he needed to photograph them and fulfill his racial fetishism. Mapplethorpe's nightly routine of cruising for models led him to meeting Milton Moore in 1980, who ultimately became his lover. Mapplethorpe's typical methods of seduction, staring, repetitious offering of cocaine, and all-around intensity frightened Moore initially. Moore was AWOL from the Navy. He was vulnerable and jobless. Mapplethorpe suggested that Moore model and offered to help him build a portfolio. This relationship reached its fullest expression in the image Man in a Polyester Suit. While this relationship may have had longevity in comparison to Mapplethorpe's other models, it was founded in Mapplethorpe's desire to feel superior and in control. This event of cruising is just one of many that turned into a photographic opportunity for Mapplethorpe and illustrate his need to feel superior at the expense of others. While Sequoia and Mapplethorpe's practices parallel in their interest in photographing friends and lovers, there's a stark contrast in their motives for photographing these individuals. Sequoia's methodology centers around relationship building. He photographs those within his social circle and never sources models. He does not want to photograph people he doesn't know. Mapplethorpe photographed as an extension of his participation in cruising culture. A lot of his desire to photograph Black men was fueled by his self-proclaimed Black fever. Power dynamics are intertwined in both Sequoia and Mapplethorpe's work. Mapplethorpe's work centers around a hierarchy of artist and subject. Sequoia challenges this method of photographing others and creates a space of non-hierarchy in his studio, and in turn, his work. Sepoya's methodologies allude to an idea of how one can represent others, a queer futurity of image making. Beginning with his exploration within the studio space, Sepoya challenges the complexities of working within a studio while also interrogating the power dynamics at play as a photographer and how that power translates to the viewer. Sepoya's drop scene is one of many of his images that illustrate a more overt queer desire and identity. This piece exemplifies Sepoya's methodological approach to making visible the power dynamics between the artist and subject. Images of Sepoya's that allude to queer desire allow one to consider the studio as a safe space for queer identifying individuals to occupy. Sepoya approaches expressing queer desire through ambiguity. He treats his collaborators as equals. It is never made explicit who is a lover or is not. Some visual signifiers may allude to same-sex desire, but more often than not, the viewer is left guessing. These equal representations aid Sepoya's ability to challenge the hierarchies that exist within studio portraiture. Drop scene depicts Sepoya seated on a plywood bench with his camera in hand as another man's backside makes contact with Sepoya. Both men are nude, and in the bottom left-hand corner lies the undergarments of one of the individuals. Their inclusion in the image reads as an act of haste, as if they were moved in a moment of intimacy. While the image is not overtly sexual, the man on the left's posture alludes to sexual intimacy. As if before or after the exposure is taken, Sepoya turns to the man to engage in what is colloquially referred to as rimming. The man on the left seems to be reaching for Sepoya with his right hand, perhaps making contact with Sepoya, but this is obscured by the ways in which both individuals' legs make contact. Sepoya layers allusions to sexual intimacy while not directly or explicitly documenting sexual acts. Sepoya's images make no direct distinction between lover or friend, rather centering his practice around intimacy